At the gates of my own sister's wedding, my father, Senator Beaumont, stopped me and said, "Your presence here is an inconvenience." My sister's new mother-in-law smirked. "We can't have someone with psychological instability ruining the photographs." They had turned my sacrifice into a source of shame. My name is Captain Diana Kelso. I am 29 years old, and on a sweltering October afternoon in Dallas, I learned the true cost of my identity. The air outside the Prestonwood Country Club was thick, a humid cocktail of expensive perfume and freshly cut grass. It felt heavier, more suffocating than the dust of Afghanistan. I stood at the edge of the manicured driveway, a fortress of old money and new power, where the emerald green lawns were maintained with more precision than my own dress uniform. In my hands I held a simple box, wrapped in brown craft paper. It felt warm, alive. Inside was the quilt I had spent the last 6 months stitching together in my barracks at Fort Hood. Each square was a piece of my grandfather's old army shirts, the faded olive drab, the crisp khaki, the soft, worn flannel. He was a retired general, the only person in my family who had ever looked at me and seen a successor, not a disappointment. This quilt was the only inheritance I cared about. I had chosen my attire with care, a simple, conservative navy blue dress. But standing there, watching the river of silk, satin, and diamonds flow past me, I felt as conspicuous as a crow in a flock of peacocks. I had taken a 3-day leave and flown all night, fueled by black coffee and a stubborn flicker of hope. I'd done it because my little sister Cordelia was getting married, and despite everything, I still believed that she would be happy to see me. I was wrong. The mistake was catastrophic. He appeared first. My father, Senator Sterling Beaumont, emerged from the grand entrance, a walking monument of tailored gray wool and political ambition. My mother, Margot, followed a step behind, her posture perfect, her existence a silent testament to social strategy. He didn't hug me, he didn't even smile. He stopped a few feet away, creating a no-man's land on the pristine cobblestone. He was a marble wall I was meant to break myself against. "Diana," he said. His voice was the one he used for Senate floor speeches, calm, measured, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Your presence here is an inconvenience." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, disconnected from meaning. My mother's gaze slid over me and then away, her attention landing on the diamond brooch pinned to her lapel. She adjusted it, a minuscule movement that conveyed a universe of dismissal. My throat went dry. A frantic, foolish hope surged, and my hand went to my pocket, pulling out my phone. The screen lit up with Cordelia's texts from last week. "The invitation must have gotten lost in the mail, silly. Of course you have to be there. The ceremony's at 4 p.m. Don't be late." XO. I held it out, a pathetic offering of proof. My father didn't even glance at it. "The guest list," he stated, as if closing a debate, "has been finalized." The truth began to seep in then, cold and sharp as a bayonet. And then the final blow was delivered, not by family, but by an ally. Beatrice Vandergriff, the mother of the groom, glided toward us. She was a vision of old-world Texas royalty in a cream-colored Chanel suit, her silver hair sculpted into an immovable helmet. She looked at me not as a person, but as a stain on her Persian rug, something to be dealt with quickly and quietly. A thin, bloodless smile played on her lips, a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. "Senator," she said, her voice as sweet as honey and as poisonous as arsenic, "I believe we had an agreement." She finally turned her gaze fully on me. We simply can't have any psychological instability ruining the photographs. Psychological instability. The phrase struck me with the force of a physical impact. My service, the firefights, the long nights on watch, the comrades I'd lost, the quiet weight of it all. They had taken that sacrifice and twisted it into a shameful, clinical diagnosis. Behind his mother, the groom, Preston, muttered just loud enough for me to hear, a smirk on his face. She's always been so high-strung. The humiliation was absolute. It was then that I saw them, two men in nondescript black suits, earpieces coiled in their ears, detaching themselves from the shadows of the portico. They didn't approach me directly. They just stood there a few yards away, their presence a quiet, professional threat. They had security ready for me. I was the danger. Captain Diana Kelso, United States Army, was a threat to a wedding reception. I looked at my parents one last time. My father's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, already calculating the political fallout. My mother's expression was one of mild annoyance, as if I were a waiter who had spilled a drink. They looked away. My own silence was my only armor. I turned to the ornate black wrought iron bench beside the driveway. With a steady hand, I placed the brown paper box on the seat, the quilt, the legacy, the last piece of my grandfather's honor. I left it there, an offering to gods who weren't listening. I turned my back on them all and walked away, my steps even, my head held high. I didn't run, I retreated, driving down the I-35, the endless ribbon of Texas highway blurring before my eyes. I didn't cry. Tears are a luxury, a release. What I felt was something else entirely. It was a pressure buildup, a sealing off of something soft and vulnerable inside me. In the rearview mirror, I could see the Prestonwood Country Club shrinking in the distance, the little brown box on the black bench disappearing into a speck. Something inside me died on that highway, but something else, something cold and hard, and forged in the fire of their contempt, was just beginning to form. The image of that forgotten gift on the iron bench burned behind my eyelids, a brand of my exclusion. As I drove, the monotonous Texas landscape became a screen onto which my memory projected a different time, a safer place. My mind retreated to the one sanctuary I had ever known in that house. The attic of our Highland Park mansion didn't smell of money or ambition. It smelled of cedarwood, old paper, and forgotten histories. It was our fortress of solitude, mine and Cordelia's. The memory surfaced, clear and painfully vivid. I was 12, she was 8. A ferocious Texas thunderstorm was rattling the windows, and thunder cracked like artillery fire across the sky. I found her huddled in the back of my closet, trembling, her face buried in my old sweaters. I coaxed her out, leading her to the center of the dusty room. I'd spent a week cutting out glow-in-the-dark stars and pasting them to the slanted ceiling. In the dim light, they shone like a private galaxy. "See," I'd whispered, pointing up. "As long as I'm here, no monsters can get you." She had looked up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the faint green glow. That night, under those paper stars, we made a pact. We would be a team, always. I would be her maid of honor, and she would be mine. It was a sacred, childish promise, sealed in whispers, while the storm raged outside. It felt more real, more binding than any contract my father had ever signed. But children grow up, and promises, I learned, have an expiration date. Our paths diverged so sharply, it was as if we were heading to different planets. Cordelia blossomed into the perfect yellow rose of Texas. She graduated from Southern Methodist University with a degree in art history she never intended to use. chaired a charitable foundation bankrolled by our parents, and curated an Instagram feed of polo matches, debutante balls, and European vacations. She was flawless, a polished gem set exactly where she was told. I, on the other hand, chose West Point. I remember the day I told them. We were in the formal living room, a space so pristine it felt like a museum. On the walls hung massive, commissioned oil paintings of Cordelia at various ages. Cordelia at 6 on a pony, Cordelia at 16 in her debutante gown. The only photograph of me was a small framed 8x10 in my dress uniform, tucked away in a dim secondary hallway, next to a landscape of the Texas Hill Country. It was treated like an interesting but ultimately irrelevant piece of decor. When I announced my appointment to the academy, my father was silent for a long, heavy moment. He swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "Diana," he finally said, his voice laced with a disappointment, so profound it was almost pity. "The Beaumonts don't produce soldiers, we produce leaders." To him, the two were mutually exclusive. My mother was more practical in her dismay. "But your hands," she'd lamented, "they'll become so rough. And all that time in the sun." My choice wasn't a source of pride. It was a strange, unfeminine aberration, a problem to be managed. The first real crack in our sisterhood appeared after my first deployment. I came home with sand still in my boots and stories I needed to tell. I tried to explain to Cordelia the quiet strength of the Afghan women I'd met, the resilience I saw in their eyes. She was in the middle of planning a fundraising gala. She nodded absently, her eyes glazed over, before changing the subject. "Do you think lilies or hydrangeas would be better for the centerpieces, Diana?" Her world was one of floral arrangements and seating charts. Mine was one of dust, sweat, and the constant, thrumming awareness of mortality. I looked at her, and the little girl who hid from thunderstorms was gone. In her place was a stranger who spoke a language I no longer understood. She looked at me not with admiration, but with a poorly concealed pity. Then Preston Vandergriff III entered the picture, and the cracks shattered into a chasm. He was everything our family valued: wealthy, connected, and smugly confident. At a family dinner, he'd leaned back in his chair, a condescending smile on his face, and asked me, "So how long are you going to play soldier before you get tired of it?" My parents had laughed, a light, approving chuckle that validated his insult. I looked to Cordelia for defense, for a flicker of the old alliance. She said nothing. She just kept her eyes on her plate, meticulously cutting her filet mignon into perfect bloodless squares. Her silence was a betrayal louder than any word. It was an act of complicity. When they got engaged, I asked her about being her maid of honor, my voice small, hopeful. She lied, seamlessly and without blinking. "Oh, Diana, I wouldn't want to bother you," she'd said, her voice dripping with false concern. "You're always so busy with your duties." A few days later, the truth appeared on Instagram. A photo of Cordelia, radiant, surrounded by an army of blonde bridesmaids in matching silk robes, champagne flutes in hand. They were all daughters of my father's political allies and business partners. It was a merger, not a wedding party. Looking at that picture, the cold truth of it washed over me. I hadn't just been uninvited, I had been erased, deleted from the narrative she was carefully crafting for herself. The promise made under the paper stars had been sacrificed on the altar of a social alliance. I looked out at the dark, empty highway before me, and I had to wonder, at what point did our promises become so worthless? When did my sister decide that I was a liability, a price too high to pay for her perfect picture? I ended up at a Waffle House off the interstate, one of those fluorescent lit beacons of greasy comfort that never close. I sat in a red vinyl booth, staring into a mug of coffee so black and bitter it could strip paint. The numbness from the highway was wearing off, replaced by a hollow ache. The question from my memories echoed in the diner's hum. When did the promise break? I was about to find out it hadn't just broken. It had been systematically dismantled. My phone buzzed on the sticky tabletop. A text from my cousin, Leah. She was the only other person in the Beaumont clan who had chosen a life outside the society pages, working as a nurse in Houston. She was the family's other anomaly. "Diana, I am so sorry. I just heard. What they did was unforgivable. It was the Vandergriffs. They were worried about your image. Image." The word hung there on my screen, obscene in its simplicity. My entire career, the medals I earned, the men and women who had fought beside me, the friends who never came home, all of it, my entire identity, reduced to a two-syllable problem of public relations. Another text followed. "Mom said Aunt Margot told everyone you weren't feeling well enough to come. Not well. A clean, elegant, and brutally effective lie. A whisper of instability, just enough to excuse my absence without raising too many questions." A cold fury began to snake its way up my spine, pushing out the hollow ache. But that was only the preliminary report. The full intelligence briefing was yet to come. My phone rang. The caller ID read Eleanor Vance. She was my mother's best friend from their days at Smith College, a woman who had known me since I was a baby. She was a fixture of the Dallas elite, but she possessed a core of decency that my mother had long since shed. "Diana, dear, it's Eleanor." Her voice, usually so full of Southern charm, was thin and trembling. "I have to tell you something. I cannot, in good conscience, stay silent." I listened, the cheap coffee mug growing cold in my hands. She told me about a bridal luncheon at the Dallas Country Club 2 weeks prior. Over cucumber sandwiches and iced tea, Beatrice Vandergriff had casually, poisonously, mentioned to a few key guests how difficult it must be for a young woman to readjust after seeing the things I had seen. She'd used the word fragile, and my mother, Margot Beaumont, had not defended me. She had leaned in, her face a mask of feigned maternal concern, and nodded gravely. "We're helping her through it," my mother had said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "It's a long and difficult process. We just want what's best for her." Eleanor's voice broke. "Diana, she was setting the stage. She was preemptively explaining your absence. And I overheard Beatrice tell your father that they needed an assurance that you wouldn't be there, that your presence would be a distraction." The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. They hadn't just excluded me. They had pathologized me. They had taken my service, my honor, and weaponized it against me, turning it into a medical condition for their social convenience. It wasn't just an insult. It was a character assassination orchestrated by my own mother. An Arctic rage, cold and clear, flooded my system. I paid for my coffee, left the Waffle House, and sat in my truck, the engine off. I pulled out my laptop and connected to the hotspot on my phone. My fingers flew across the keyboard, logging into the secure Army portal. I searched my email archives. It took me less than a minute to find it. An email from my father's chief of staff, sent 3 months ago. Subject: October schedule. It was a polite inquiry, asking if I had any leave scheduled for the fall, specifically around the weekend of October 14th. My reply was right below it, confirming my 3-day leave and providing the exact dates. They knew I was free. They knew I would come. Cordelia's text about the lost invitation was a calculated lie, a piece of bait in a carefully laid trap. This wasn't a last-minute decision. It was a premeditated ambush, designed to lure me to the gates just so they could slam them in my face. My hands were shaking, but not with sadness. It was pure, unadulterated fury. I pulled up Leah's number and hit dial. My voice, when I spoke, was unrecognizable to me. It was flat, cold, and devoid of all emotion. The voice of a commanding officer demanding a situation report. "Leah, I need you to tell me the truth. Was my name ever on the original guest list?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled only by the sound of her shaky breath. Then a sob. "No," she whispered, the word cracking. "It was never there. I overheard Mom talking to Aunt Margot weeks ago. They said it was part of the deal with the Vandergriffs." A deal. The word echoed in the silent cab of my truck. I wasn't a sister, a daughter. I was a clause, a liability to be negotiated away in a merger between two powerful families. I was a term and condition in Cordelia's marriage contract. That was it. That was the moment the ice in my veins solidified. I ended the call. The mission had changed. This was no longer about a party, a dress, or a piece of cake. This was about honor. I started the engine of my truck. The destination was no longer Fort Hood. I was turning the vehicle around. I was going back, not to beg for an invitation. I was going back to reclaim my name. The drive back to the Beaumont mansion was a tactical operation. The anger that had ignited in the Waffle House had cooled into something far more dangerous: resolve. I wasn't returning as a wounded daughter. I was returning as an officer conducting a reconnaissance of a battleground. I didn't sneak in. I used the spare key that had been on my chain for a decade, letting myself in through the side door. The house was eerily silent, a grand hollow mausoleum, smelling of lemon polish and refrigerated air. Every surface gleamed. Every object was in its perfect, soulless place. It was a home designed for magazine spreads, not for living. I ignored the pristine living room and the formal dining room, my boots making no sound on the thick oriental rugs. I went straight upstairs, my objective clear. I went to my room. The door swung open, and the air rushed out of my lungs. A cold, physical shock jolted through me. It was empty, not just tidy, but erased. The wall where my map of Afghanistan had been pinned, dotted with locations of past missions, was now a blank expanse of beige paint, the only evidence of its past being faint, pinprick scars in the drywall. My simple twin bed was gone, replaced by a gray velvet chaise lounge that looked like it had never been sat on. Everything that had defined the space as mine, my high school swimming trophies, my framed military commendations, my worn copy of Shelby Foote's The Civil War, had vanished. They hadn't just turned me away from a wedding. They had wiped my entire existence from the fabric of this house, my heart pounding a heavy, sickening rhythm. I went to the storage room at the end of the hall, and there they were. My things, my life, were crammed into cardboard moving boxes, stacked unceremoniously next to old, dusty containers of Christmas ornaments. As I pulled one open, I saw my military medals tossed in with old textbooks. In another box, I found a shoebox full of handwritten letters from my unit, letters that had kept me sane in the desert. My mother had clearly deemed them clutter. It was while I was dragging a box labeled Diana Misk across the floor that I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway, the sound of a car door slamming. Then their voices, light and laughing, floated up the grand staircase. They were home. I didn't hide. I stood my ground in the hallway as they came up the stairs. My father, my mother, Cordelia, in her ridiculously expensive wedding dress, and her new husband, Preston. They stopped short when they saw me, their festive mood evaporating like mist. My father's face hardened from surprise to irritation. "Diana, what in God's name are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. I straightened to my full height, letting go of the box. I faced them, all four of them, a united front of silk and privilege. "I'm here to collect my belongings," I said, my voice steady, level. Since it's clear they no longer have a place in this house, my gaze locked onto Cordelia's. "Why, Cordelia? Why lie to me?" Preston, ever the gallant protector, stepped forward. "Now listen," he began, his tone patronizing. "It was a complicated decision." "I wasn't asking you," I cut him off, my voice like ice. The words sliced through the air, and he recoiled as if struck. I kept my eyes fixed on my sister. I was asking her. The weight of 4 pairs of eyes fell on Cordelia. Her perfect porcelain facade began to crack. Her lower lip trembled. The bride started to break. I didn't know what to do," she wailed, tears welling in her eyes, threatening her flawless makeup. "The Vandergriffs, they put so much pressure on us. They said you were too intense." Then she looked right at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something raw and real in her eyes, something beyond the vacant polish. It was a bitter, curdled envy. "You were always the strong one," she spat, the words laced with a decade of resentment. "You got to leave. You got to choose your own life, build your own world. I'm the one who's stuck here. I'm the one who has to please everyone, every single day." Her voice rose, hysterical. "Getting you off the list, it was just easier than fighting for you." Her confession didn't evoke my pity. It brought a terrifying clarity. Everything crystallized in that moment. "So that's what this was all about," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet calm. The entire family flinched. "You weren't afraid I was unstable. You were afraid I was stable. You were afraid of the truth I represent." I turned my back on my parents and Preston, focusing only on her. "I hope you're happy with your choices, Cordelia. I truly do. But remember this, the people you're so desperate to please today will be the first ones to throw you away tomorrow, when you're no longer convenient." I bent down, picked up the last box, the one with the letters, and walked towards the staircase. I paused at the top step. "This is the last time I will ever set foot in this house," I said, not to them, but to myself. It was a vow. And then I walked away, down the stairs and out the door, and I never once looked back. I didn't drive back to Fort Hood, not right away. Instead, I just drove. My old Ford pickup truck, with its familiar dents and peeling paint, ate up the miles of Texas blacktop. I drove west into the vast, empty heart of the state, where the sky was a brutal, endless blue, and the landscape was a monotonous panorama of scrub brush and pump jacks. The emptiness outside mirrored the cavernous hollow inside my chest. I had faced the enemy. I had spoken the truth. I had won. But the victory tasted like ash. It tasted like loss. There was no elation, no sense of justice served. There was only the quiet, sickening realization that I was utterly alone. In my war for self-respect, I had successfully amputated a toxic part of my life, but the wound was raw, gaping, and weeping. Somewhere past Abilene, as dusk painted the horizon in shades of bruised purple and orange, I pulled off the highway and into the gravel lot of a small, nondescript diner. It was the kind of place that time had forgotten, with cracked linoleum floors and the lingering smell of stale coffee and bacon grease. I slid into a booth, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally draining away, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. A waitress, a woman whose face was a roadmap of a long, hard life, came over. She didn't say much, just filled my coffee cup. A few minutes later, she returned and silently placed a slice of warm apple pie in front of me, a scoop of vanilla ice cream melting on top. I looked up, confused. I didn't order this. She gave me a small, weary smile, her eyes kind. "You look like you need it, honey," she said softly. "It's on the house." That small, unexpected act of kindness from a complete stranger did what my own family's cruelty could not. It made my throat tighten, and I had to stare hard at the swirling pattern of my coffee to keep the tears from falling. Later that night, in a cheap motel room that smelled of disinfectant and old cigarette smoke, sleep wouldn't come. The silence was too loud. I lay on top of the stiff polyester bedspread, staring at the water-stained ceiling. I needed an anchor, something to hold on to in the storm raging inside me. I reached for my phone, scrolling aimlessly, looking for a distraction, a lifeline. My fingers stopped on an old audio file I'd downloaded years ago at the academy. It was a recording of General Douglas MacArthur's 1962 farewell address to the cadets at West Point, the famous Duty, Honor, Country speech. I had memorized passages of it for class, had heard it referenced 100 times. But that night, lying in that lonely motel room, I listened to it as if for the first time. The old general's voice, frail but resolute, crackled through the tiny phone speaker. Duty, honor, country, those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be. He spoke of building character, of tempering the will, of creating men who were strong enough to know when they are weak, and brave enough to face themselves when they are afraid. Each word was a stone being laid, building a foundation inside of me where there had only been rubble. My family had tried to define me by their own twisted metrics: wealth, social standing, political convenience, a pretty picture. They had failed. My career, my choice to serve, had never been an act of rebellion against them. It was a pilgrimage toward a higher code, a clearer set of values. Duty, honor, country, those weren't just words, they were my true north. They were a creed that could not be bought, sold, or negotiated away in a marriage contract. They were the principles of a family I had chosen, a brotherhood and sisterhood bound by shared sacrifice, not by blood. The betrayal of the Beaumonts and the Vandergrifts could not define me. Only my adherence to my code could. I wonder if you've ever had a moment like that. A moment in the dark when a voice from the past, a line from a book, or a simple memory becomes the only light you have, reminding you of who you truly are when the world is trying to tell you you're someone else. As the first rays of the Texas sun broke over the flat horizon, a shift occurred within me. The pain was still there, a dull ache in my soul, but it was no longer the whole story. It had been demoted. It was now just a chapter, not the entire book. My purpose, which had been shattered, was beginning to reform, stronger and more resilient. I packed my few things, left a $20 bill on the nightstand for the pie I never paid for, and walked out into the cool morning air. I started the engine of my truck, the familiar rumble a comfort. This time, as I pulled back onto the highway, I knew exactly where I was going. I wasn't running away from a broken past anymore. I was driving home, to my real family. to the men and women who lived and breathed the meaning of those 3 hallowed words. The main gate at Fort Hood isn't framed by ornate ironwork or manicured flower beds, like the entrance to the Prestonwood Country Club. It's functional, imposing, and made of steel. But when the young private at the guard post snapped to attention, gave me a sharp salute, and said, "Welcome back, Captain," a profound sense of relief washed over me. I felt like I could finally breathe. I was home. The air here didn't smell of cloying perfume and hypocrisy. It smelled of diesel fuel, hot asphalt, and the honest sweat of hard work. It was the scent of reality. I parked my dusty pickup in my designated spot outside the officers' quarters, the cardboard boxes filled with the fragments of my past life rattling in the truck bed. I stepped out, stretched my stiff limbs, and took a long, deep breath. This was my territory. This was where my strength wasn't a flaw to be concealed, but an asset to be honed. I saw him waiting for me by the entrance to my building. First Sergeant Marcus Thorne, my right-hand man, the most dependable soldier I had ever known. He was a broad-shouldered man of few words, with eyes that had seen enough combat to strip away all pretense. He didn't ask about my trip. He didn't ask why there were dark circles under my eyes. He just gave me a single, solid nod. "Good to have you back, Captain," he said, his voice a low rumble. He took my duffel bag from my hand without being asked. "The guys fired up the grill. Figured you'd be hungry." The guys, my platoon, were gathered in the common area behind the barracks. They had dragged out a portable BBQ pit, and the smell of slow-cooked Texas brisket hung heavy and delicious in the air. A cooler full of iced-down Shinerbach beer sat nearby. Someone had a radio playing a George Strait song. The easy laughter and casual camaraderie of it all felt like the most powerful medicine in the world. It was normal. Beautifully, blessedly normal. This was my real family, the one forged not by accident of birth, but by choice and shared purpose. I spent the next hour perched on the tailgate of a Humvee, a paper plate loaded with brisket and potato salad on my lap, a cold bottle of beer in my hand. No one asked me about my sister's wedding. No one mentioned the Beaumonts or the Vandergriffs. They knew I'd been on leave for a family event, and they knew I'd returned alone, a day early. They were smart enough to connect the dots and respectful enough not to trace the lines out loud. Instead, they asked about my truck's engine, debated the Dallas Cowboys' chances of making the playoffs, and ribbed each other with the familiar, rough affection of soldiers. They treated me exactly as they always did, as Captain Kelso, their CO, their sister in arms. Here, my honor wasn't a topic for debate. It was a given. My value wasn't measured by my social connections. It was measured by my competence and my character. I realized then that true loyalty isn't declared in flowery speeches or demonstrated with grand gestures. Sometimes it's as simple and as profound as a slice of brisket and a cold beer, shared in comfortable silence among people who have your back, no questions asked. It was a welcome more sincere than any polite hug or air kiss I had ever received in my father's house. Later, as the sun began to set and the men started to drift away, Sergeant Thorne lingered. He stood beside me, leaning against the Humvee, looking out at the vast Texas sky. For a while, he just watched the colors change. "Captain," he said finally, his gaze still on the horizon. "Whatever happened back in Dallas, that's their world. It can't touch who you are here." He paused, choosing his next words with care, the way a soldier plans his next move. "There's a good confidential counseling program on base, for officers." He glanced at me, his expression one of pure professional respect. You know, even the toughest armor needs maintenance now and then. Make sure there are no weak spots. It's not a weakness, ma'am. It's just maintenance. His words hit me with a quiet force. He wasn't pitying me. He was advising me, soldier to soldier. He saw me not as a broken woman, but as a leader. And every good leader knows the importance of maintaining their most critical weapon, their own mind. He was offering me a tool, not a crutch. That single piece of advice, offered with such quiet dignity, planted a seed in the scorched earth of my mind. A new strategy began to form. Sergeant Thorne's words about maintenance echoed in my mind for a week. He was right. In the field, you clean your rifle, check your gear, and maintain your vehicles. You don't wait for them to fail in the middle of a firefight. I had been treating my own mind with less care than I treated my standard issue equipment. It was time for some maintenance. The behavioral health office was in a nondescript building on the far side of the base. The therapist was a retired Army major named Dr. Evans, a man with kind eyes and a firm handshake. His office wasn't intimidating. It was just a quiet room with 2 comfortable armchairs, a few generic landscape paintings on the walls, and a window that looked out onto a dusty parade ground. But for me, walking through that door and sitting in that chair felt more daunting than rappelling from a helicopter. The Army drills discipline and self-reliance into you. You are taught to suppress, to endure, to compartmentalize. To admit you need help feels like admitting to a fundamental flaw in your armor, a chink that could compromise the entire mission. I sat there for the first 10 minutes in complete silence, my hands clenched so tightly in my lap, my knuckles were white. I just stared at a spot on the carpet. Dr. Evans didn't push, he didn't prod, he just waited, his own silence a comfortable, patient presence. It was the polar opposite of my mother's judgmental silences. His was filled with acceptance, not expectation. Finally, I started to talk. My voice was flat at first, the emotion carefully scrubbed from it, as if I were delivering a formal after-action report. I recounted the events at the country club, the words that were said, the discovery of my empty room. I laid out the facts, point by point, a sterile recitation of my own humiliation. But as I spoke, the carefully constructed walls I had built around the pain began to crumble. I heard my own voice crack when I described Cordelia's envious glare. I talked about the crushing weight of my father's lifelong disappointment. I finally gave voice to the profound violation of being erased from my own home. For the first time, I wasn't just reporting on the wound. I was allowing myself to feel its full, searing depth. Dr. Evans listened. He didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. He simply provided a safe space for the truth to be heard. Occasionally, he'd ask a sharp, insightful question that was like a probe, gently exploring the patterns of my life, the constant gnawing hunger for my father's approval, the years of suppressed anger that had finally found a voice. He didn't give me the answers. He just handed me a map and a compass and helped me learn to read them myself. It was during our 3rd session that he introduced a concept that would change everything. "Captain," he said, leaning forward slightly, "what you've experienced is a form of trauma, a betrayal of the deepest trust. But the critical question isn't just, how do you heal from this? The more powerful question is, who can you become because of this?" He told me about an idea in psychology called post-traumatic growth, the theory that profound struggle and adversity don't just have to be survived, they can be a catalyst for profound positive change, forcing you to develop new strengths, new perspectives, and a deeper sense of purpose. That idea hit me like a revelation. It reframed my entire experience. The betrayal was no longer just an ugly scar to be hidden. It could be the foundation for something stronger, a launch pad. It wasn't an end point, it was a starting point. My family's actions had created a crater in my life, but it was up to me what I chose to build in it. He then asked me a simple question that cut through all the noise. Forget about your family for a moment, Captain. In your entire career, what is the one thing that has given you the most profound sense of meaning? I didn't have to think about it. The answer was immediate and absolute. Training my soldiers, I said, taking young green lieutenants and helping to shape them into leaders. Watching them find their strength, that's what matters. As I said the words, a light went on inside me, a powerful, clarifying flame, the passion for teaching, for mentorship, for forging the next generation of leaders. It was the part of my job I loved most, West Point. The name surfaced in my mind, clear and bright. The place where it all began for me. The idea of returning, not as a cadet learning the code, but as an instructor teaching it, was electrifying. It would be the most powerful statement I could possibly make. It would be the ultimate rebuttal to the lie that I was unstable. It would be taking the very thing they tried to use as a weapon against me, my identity as a soldier, and transforming it into my greatest source of influence. It would be turning my pain into my purpose. That night, I didn't lie awake, staring at the ceiling. I sat at the small desk in my quarters, my laptop open, the official West Point faculty Kewiko application portal on the screen. For the first time in weeks, the fog of confusion and hurt had lifted, replaced by a sharp, focused sense of mission. I wasn't just healing, I was rebuilding, on my own terms, according to my own strategic map. 3 months later, I found myself driving through the gates of West Point. The autumn air in the Hudson Valley was crisp and clean, and the trees had exploded into a breathtaking tapestry of crimson, gold, and orange. The ancient gray granite buildings of the academy stood like silent sentinels against the vibrant foliage, radiating a sense of permanence and history. As I walked across the plain, the parade ground where generations of leaders had marched, a profound sense of peace settled over me. This was the place where the words duty, honor, country weren't just a motto on a crest, they were the very air you breathed. I wasn't nervous. I felt like I was coming home to the source of my own code. The interview for the instructor position in the military history department was held in a formidable, oak-paneled room in Taylor Hall. The walls were lined with the portraits of long-dead generals, their painted eyes seeming to follow my every move. I sat at a long, polished table, facing a panel of 5 senior officers. At the center of the panel sat a 3-star general, a man with steel-gray hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. I recognized him instantly, General Davies. He had been a friend of my grandfather's, a man from the same mold of quiet integrity. He looked at my file, then fixed his gaze on me. "Captain Kelso," he began, his voice calm but carrying immense weight. "Your record is exemplary, but leadership isn't theoretical. Tell us about a time you had to make a command decision where your personal loyalties conflicted with the demands of the mission." The question hung in the air, a deliberate test. He wasn't just asking about tactics, he was asking about character. I could have talked about my family. It would have been the easy, dramatic answer, but I didn't. That was a private war, not a professional case study. Instead, I took a breath and spoke of a hot, dusty afternoon in the Kandahar province of Afghanistan. I described a situation where my platoon was tasked with holding a small, strategically insignificant village. We had fought hard to take it, and my personal loyalty was to the men we had lost in the process, to the ground we had paid for in blood. But new intelligence revealed a major enemy movement elsewhere. Holding the village would mean being cut off and likely annihilated, achieving nothing. The mission required a tactical withdrawal to preserve combat strength for a more decisive engagement. My loyalty to the memory of our fallen soldiers screamed at me to hold that ground, I said, my voice steady. But my duty to the living men under my command and to the larger mission demanded that I order them to retreat. The correct decision is not always the one that feels best, General. Sometimes true leadership is the lonely business of choosing the greater good over the satisfying sentiment. When I finished, the room was completely silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. General Davies held my gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. The letter arrived 2 weeks later. It was in a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Military Academy. My hand trembled slightly as I slid it open with my pocket knife. I unfolded the heavy paper. We are pleased to inform you that the Academic Board has approved your appointment. We would be honored to welcome Captain Diana Kelso to the faculty as an assistant professor of military history. I read the sentence over and over again, the words blurring slightly. This was more than a job offer. This was vindication. This was my Declaration of Independence, written by the most respected military institution in the world. Beatrice Vandergriff and my own mother had whispered that I was emotionally unstable, a fragile liability. And now West Point was entrusting me with the minds of its future leaders. It was the best revenge I could have ever imagined, not to tear them down, but to build myself up to a place they could never touch. For a fleeting moment, I wished they could see this letter. Then the feeling passed. Their opinion no longer mattered. My new life began with a welcome reception for new faculty at the West Point Club. It was a formal affair, full of colonels and department heads discussing strategy and geopolitics. I felt a familiar sense of being slightly out of place until my eyes were drawn to a quiet corner of the room. A man stood there, completely absorbed in a large painting of the Battle of Gettysburg. He wasn't in uniform. He had tweed jacket, glasses, and an air of thoughtful intelligence. When he noticed me, he smiled. "It's incredible, isn't it?" he said, gesturing to the painting. "The turning point of the entire war, and it all came down to a few hundred men on a rocky hill." He introduced himself as Dr. Alistair Finch, a civilian professor of American history. He didn't ask about my rank or my deployments. He asked what I thought of General Chamberlain's decision to order a bayonet charge at Little Round Top. Our conversation flowed for hours, a seamless exchange of ideas about history, honor, and the impossible choices that forge a person's character. For the first time in a very long time, I was talking to a man who saw my mind before he saw my uniform, and in that quiet corner, amidst the clinking of glasses and political small talk, I felt the unmistakable beginning of a new chapter. 6 months passed, 6 months of blessed, disciplined peace. My life at West Point settled into a rhythm that was both demanding and deeply restorative. My days were filled with lectures on Napoleonic tactics, lively debates with cadets whose minds were sharp and eager, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing them grow. My evenings were for quiet conversations with Alistair, dissecting historical battles over dinner, or for solitary walks along Flirtation Walk, watching the barges move slowly down the Hudson River as dusk settled. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't fighting. I wasn't defending my choices, wasn't bracing for the next passive-aggressive remark, wasn't trying to earn an approval that would never come. I was simply living. I had stopped checking Cordelia's Instagram feed. I no longer scanned the political news for my father's name. That entire world, the world of the Beaumonts and the Vandergriffs, had faded, becoming as distant and unreal as an old black-and-white movie. I had finally understood that true peace wasn't found in winning the war against them, but in simply decommissioning the battlefield. I had achieved peace through forgetting, and then one Tuesday afternoon, the past sent a dispatch. It was there in the stack of mail in my faculty mailbox, tucked between academic journals and department memos. A single, pale pink envelope that stood out like a flamingo in a flock of pigeons. The handwriting was instantly, painfully familiar. It was Cordelia's, loopy, elegant, and infused with a sense of entitlement, even in its curves. My heart gave a single, hard thump against my ribs, an involuntary conditioned response, an old battle station alert. I didn't open it right away. I carried it back to my quarters and placed it on my desk. For 2 days it sat there, a pastel-colored, unexploded ordnance. I would look at it, feel the phantom limb of our shared history ache, and then turn back to grading papers. I was no longer a soldier who reacted instantly to a threat. I was a strategist who chose the time and place of engagement. On the third evening, I made myself a cup of strong Earl Grey tea, sat down at my desk, and finally opened the letter. The paper was expensive, thick, and smelled faintly of her perfume. Cordelia's handwriting was shaky, the elegant loops occasionally dissolving into jagged strokes. There were faint, circular stains on the page, the unmistakable evidence of fallen tears. The letter was a confession from inside a gilded cage. Her life, she wrote, the one she had sold her soul for, was a gilded hell. The Vandergriff family, pillars of Texas society, were embroiled in a nasty financial scandal involving offshore accounts and SEC investigations. The family name was being dragged through the mud. Preston, her perfect husband, had revealed himself to be a controlling, short-tempered tyrant, his charm fading as the pressure mounted. "I have everything I thought I ever wanted," she wrote. "The perfect dress, the perfect house in Highland Park, the perfect husband. But I have never felt so empty. I look at the wedding photos, and all I see is a transaction. I realize now that I sold my own sister for a seat at a table that's about to collapse. I miss you, Diana. I miss the sister who promised to protect me from monsters under the bed. I never realized the biggest monster was my own weakness." The letter ended with a desperate, tear-stained plea, a rambling, heartfelt apology, followed by the inevitable question, "Can we please just start over?" I put the letter down and stared out the window at the darkening Hudson. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel vindictive pleasure. I mostly felt a profound, weary sadness. Her apology felt genuine, but it was a foxhole prayer, born from the terror of her own collapsing world, not from a true understanding of the pain she had inflicted. She was reaching out to me now because her own life raft was sinking. I didn't reply that night or the next. I let her words settle. I thought about what starting over really meant. You can't erase the past. You can't unsay the words or undo the betrayals. To pretend otherwise would be to build a new relationship, on the same rotten foundations as the old one. A week later, I sat down at my desk again. I took out a sheet of my own simple cream-colored stationery. I wrote my reply, my handwriting steady and clear. I did not write in anger or with recrimination. "Cordelia," I wrote, "I have received your letter. I appreciate its honesty. I accept your apology. Not for you, but for me. I am choosing to release the weight of the past. But we cannot start over. That little girl in the attic is gone, and we cannot go back there. We can only start from here, from who we are now. A new relationship between us, if one is to exist, must be built on a foundation of absolute truth and mutual respect. There will be no more convenient lies, no more managing of my identity for the comfort of others. No more silence in the face of injustice." I was laying down the terms of engagement. I was setting my boundaries, not with anger, but with the calm authority of a woman who finally knew her own worth. This time, if there was to be a relationship, it would be on my terms. I sealed the envelope, a quiet sense of finality settling over me. I had finally learned to be my own protector. Thanksgiving. The word had always conjured images of the Beaumont dining room. The oppressive gleam of polished sterling silver, the cold clink of Waterford crystal, the strained formal conversation that danced around everything and meant nothing. This Thanksgiving was different. The setting was not a cavernous mansion, but my modest, cozy faculty apartment at West Point. The air wasn't thick with tension and expensive perfume. It was rich with the warm, honest smells of roast turkey, sage stuffing, and pumpkin pie. The guest list wasn't a who's who of Texas politics and industry. It was my family. Alistair was here, his easy laughter filling the space between conversations. First Sergeant Thorne had driven all the way up from Fort Hood, a quiet, solid presence who looked completely at home on my sofa. And gathered around the table were a handful of my cadets, young men and women who couldn't make it home for the holiday, their bright, eager faces a testament to the future. The conversation wasn't about mergers or stock portfolios. We talked about books. We debated the strategies of Belisarius versus Scipio Africanus. We laughed about a training exercise that had gone wrong. No one was performing. No one was trying to impress anyone. We were simply together. After dinner, as we sat with coffee, Alistair handed me a flat, carefully wrapped gift. I unwrapped it to find a beautiful antique map of the Hudson Valley, centered on West Point, housed in a simple, elegant oak frame. He looked at me, his eyes warm and full of understanding. "People usually fight for land," he said softly, his voice just for me. "But I think sometimes we have to fight to find the land that belongs to us. This is your territory, Diana." I looked from the map to the faces in the room, to Thorne, the embodiment of loyalty, to my cadets, the embodiment of legacy, to Alistair, the embodiment of a partnership built on mutual respect. He was right. I had lost a mansion in Dallas, a cold estate built on transactions. But I had found a home in the Hudson Valley. This home wasn't built with money or power. It was built with honor, fortified with loyalty, and filled with a love I had chosen for myself. In that moment, looking at the life I had built, I realized that being barred from my sister's wedding, as painful as it was the greatest stroke of luck in my life. In the military, we have a term for it, a strategic reassessment, an unexpected event that forces you to abandon a failing objective and pivot towards a more achievable one. The rejection had forced me to abandon a battle I could never win. the war for approval in a place where none was ever offered. It had violently pushed me off a path that was not my own and forced me to navigate by my own internal compass: duty, honor, country. From those three hallowed words, I had plotted a new course. I had built a new life. Later that evening, when the last of the guests had departed, Alistair and I stood by the large window in my living room, looking out at the scattered lights of the academy glittering in the cold, clear night. I thought of my other family, the Beaumonts, in their other world. I felt no anger, no resentment, only a serene, insurmountable distance, the way you might feel when looking at a foreign country on a map, a place you once came from, but to which you can never and would never return. Their legacy was one of buildings with their name on them, of political handshakes and carefully managed bank accounts, a legacy of appearances. My legacy was here. It was in the minds of the leaders I was helping to shape. It was in the quiet integrity of men like Sergeant Thorne. It was in the shared warmth of a conversation with a man I loved. It was a legacy of substance. I, Captain Diana Kelso, had finally learned the last, most important lesson of my command. Sometimes you have to be rejected by the family you were born into to be free to create the one you were meant to have, and that legacy no one could ever take away. My story found its home in the Hudson Valley, but it is just one story among millions. Perhaps it reminded you of a battle you have fought, or a family you have chosen. These are the stories of quiet strength and hard-won peace that connect us all. If this one resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. We would be honored to read your own story in the comments below. For more stories that celebrate the courage it takes to define your own honor, subscribe to the Chosen Revenge Library.